This weekly reflection is on Dennis Ford's book, the preface, the introduction, the chapter on mythology. I'm going back over it as a weekly reflection for my students. I'm focusing on the portions of that reading that deal with meaning, myth, and belief. Does life have meaning? People invest their lives with meaning differently. We're reluctant to talk about meaninglessness because of what it might reveal about us. Is life meaningful? Some say we're less than human if we fail to ask ourselves that question. The question of meaning preoccupied much of the 19th and 20th century in philosophy, literature, and theology. The question of meaning signifies a religious search normally, but it is also a philosophical, psychological, and mythological search as well. Ford's book is about the search for meaning rather than the search for God. Meaning is not only something we once had and have lost, but is something toward which we are perpetually striving. Meaninglessness represents an inability to persuasively answer the why questions about our beliefs and our actions. As long as we're immersed in culture, we're not challenged to step back from our day-to-day living to ask these questions. And our greatest need and our most difficult achievement, according to Bruno Bettelheim, is to find meaning in our lives. According to Viktor Frankl, we have seen that today man's search for meaning is unsatisfied, and this constitutes what he called the pathology of our age. Doubt or stepping back is the starting point of philosophy. Erich Fromm said that. The meaningfulness of our acts is not inherent in the acts themselves, but in how I understand these acts and the motivations I have for performing them. What do we mean by meaning? What do we mean by myth? To talk about myth is to violate it. The proper question to ask of myth is not what does it mean, but what happens next? How does it end? The mythic mind is a mind of becoming rather than of static being. It stays close to the surface of things. It merely talks about life without really knowing anything about life at all. There is no thematic or conceptual summary that one can form of a myth. It's just not possible. Myth presupposes another sacred plane that is ontologically different from our day-to-day profane world. To the mythic mind, every object in this world can be transparent or transcendent. The myths do not change, and by identifying with the universal and unchanging narrative of myth, we're lifted out of our normal lives, and as a consequence, the reality of day-to-day life becomes secondary to the enduring reality of the sacred. The mythic story is not idiosyncratic to me or to my time and place. It is not my story. We miss something essential if we do not distinguish between knowing about myth and living mythically. The word about connotes a separation between the knower and the known that is alien to genuine myth. Belief is analogous to knowing about. Belief rests between complete skepticism and certain knowledge. Beliefs can be true or false, whereas knowledge, according to Ford, is unassailable. Faith elevates belief to a religious level. Faith engages the heart and soul. For the faithful, it's not enough to know about. Within myth, the faithful are without belief. They simply and unselfconsciously respond to the world. The myth implicitly presents the world as it is, not as it may possibly be. We become concerned with beliefs and myth when faith and living within myth fails. When we ask why and what for, myth becomes self-conscious. To ask critical or abstract questions about myth is already to violate the mythic mind. Myth is neither allegory nor philosophy, but identification. Myths calm the mind by staying close to the surface of things. They're compelling. Myths work because of our identification with the story and its characters. We cannot ask of a myth whether it is true or false. We do not believe in a myth, rather we encounter a compelling force whose power we cannot question. The only way to challenge a myth is to confront it with another, more compelling myth. Whenever I interrupt my actions to reflect on why, the question of meaning and purpose will likely occur. Myth works at a far deeper level than story. It is pre- or subconscious. Myth is invisible. Within myth, I do not see the myth itself. Myths not only configure existing facts, they determine which facts we seek and notice. We can never think entirely outside of myth, and at a deeper level, myth subconsciously structures how we configure the whole of our experience. Experience takes shape and becomes visible because of the subconsciously held myths that we employ, and these subconsciously held myths tell us what to notice and what to ignore, what is meaningful and what is not. Living within myth, we are liberated from the existential burden of knowing what to do and who we are. We know not by knowing about myth, but by living mythically. And mythical thinking does not permit us to formulate an abstract or conceptual question such as, what is the meaning of life? Myth does not permit us to step outside of myth. We can ask of myths whether they are alive or dead, but not whether they are true or false. Faith and commitment are more characteristic of mythical thinking than are doubt and skepticism. Myth is our original condition. The proponents of mythical thinking argue that we are never outside of myth. They would argue that from this perspective, the Enlightenment is actually a movement from one myth to another, albeit a secular myth. Meaning is the price we pay for self-consciousness. For those who live mythically, there is a distance between the knower and the known. The world in which we live simply is, and we respond. Whenever we step back to capture one myth or another, or to ask the question why, we are already outside of myth. We start to think about myth rather than living mythically. Stepping back from living mythically announces the beginning of the philosophical mind.